sinners return to him, that he may revive us, that he may restore us.
Good morning, everybody. So good to be able to be with you guys again. This morning, I've chosen for our subject a title called The Battle for Our Hearts. And I've been working, as I had mentioned last week, in the book of Samuel, First Samuel and Second Samuel. And the Lord has been opening up some wonderful teachings to me in terms of my own heart and the things that I've been learning. And of course, always what I want to do with the heart of the teacher is to be able to share it. I can't wait to share it with everybody else. I'm wanting to begin by referring us to the New Testament, in particular to the book of Romans, chapter 7. Verse 18, I believe it is, where the Apostle Paul talks about the battle that he gets into, that he's continually engaged in, where he wants to do the things that he knows he would like to do, but it's the things that he doesn't want to do, he finds himself doing. I'm going to just read it so that I don't get you all too confused. It says, I know that nothing good lives in me. It's my sinful nature, for I have the desire to do what is good, but I can't carry it out. What I do is not the good I want to do, no, the evil I do not want to do. This is what I keep on doing. And so what the Apostle Paul is talking about is this continual battle that he is involved in. And I came to see this week, the Lord showed me that this was the battle that King Saul was also involved in. What happened was that, as you remember in the story, the people wanted a king. And what they did was they actually approached the prophet Samuel and said, we would like to be the other nations. Like the other nations, we want to have a king over us. And part of that was because they didn't like the fact that they couldn't see the king. We talked about this last week. They were continually looking to build idols and cover them with gold and all sorts of things. They wanted a God that they could see. And in the same way, what God said was that when they asked for a king, they were actually rejecting God. They wanted someone that they could follow. And to have someone they could follow for them meant that they would be able to see this someone. And so they told the prophet Samuel that they wanted a king. God recognized that as a betrayal of everything that he had been looking to establish in terms of relationship with Israel. But he said, you know what? If that's what you want, that's what you're going to get. And so what happened was that God had heard the hearts of the people who had said, we would like a king, and he needs to be like the other kings. Well, it's really interesting what God did. He went out and he found a man who was head above all of the other men. In other words, he stood out because he was so tall. He was large. He was unlike any of the other men. And as I was reading, I realized that what God was doing was providing them with what they wanted. The people wanted someone who was different, someone who looked like a king, someone who could lead them, someone who would be in charge of all the problems. And that needed to be someone who looked like a king. And so what God did was he went out and he found Saul. But you know what? What's really, really interesting was that Saul was not the person that the people thought he was. In 1 Samuel 15, verse 17, it says, Saul was small in his own eyes. Have you ever noticed that? In verse 17, chapter 15, Saul was small in his own eyes. And in fact, what happened is that he was told by, or Samuel rather, no, I think it was actually Saul that was told by God that he would change him. He would make him into a different person. It's a huge statement. It's an absolutely huge statement because God knew that this person that he was choosing to lead Israel looked to Israel as though he would be a king. But God knew this was not the man who was made to be king. And so the first thing that God did was he changed him into a different person. In fact, the people, when they saw him dancing in the streets and prophesying with the priest, says, "Who is this? Has Saul become a priest?" They didn't know who this person was because this was not the man that they had come to recognize. Isn't it interesting that very often we do not see ourselves the way that God sees us? But isn't it also interesting that God is prepared to go to any measure to equip us for the task that God has in hand? And so he actually changed Saul's personality. Now, there's something else that I want you to notice, because it was not that Saul was just a tall man that caused the people to see him as the king and also caused God to choose him. And when we look at Saul, we say, yes, he was tall. He looked through the eyes of the people to be the man. But look what happened when Samuel came to anoint Saul. He couldn't be found. He was hiding in amongst the baggage. He was so scared of what was going to be done in terms of anointing him to be king, and he could not see himself as the king. So he went and hid in amongst the baggage. It's an amazing picture when you think about it. This man whom God has chosen and whom the people imagine will be the king is anything but equipped to be the king. And so God has to say, you are going to be changed. You are going to be changed. Well, it brings us to this incredible scenario whereby that we are reminded in Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 23, that our lives are not our own. We were bought and paid for at a price, according to the book of First Corinthians chapter 6:19. We were paid for, we belong to God. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that it doesn't matter who we are, God will make us to be who he needs us to be? Well, hold on and wait for the rest of the story. Even though every other part of us may be changed and may be transformed, there is one part that God won't touch. In terms of our flesh, we are, as Paul says, plagued by the fact that our sin nature continually rises up. Our sin nature is continually calling us to do the things we don't want to do. There's another part of us, which is our spirit, the spirit that is joined with God's spirit, that wants to do the things that we should do, wants to, desires to. But in this battle that goes on, there's a third party to the activity that's taking place, and that is our soul. And as we know, our soul is comprised of our mind, our emotions, our feelings. And what has to happen is the part of us that says, I'd like to do good, which is the spirit in us joined to God, now has to send that message to our mind, to our flesh, to our soul, where the soul will agree and step into conformity to do the good that it wants to do. The problem is sin is always there with us. Sin in our flesh, sin, our fallen nature. And so this battle is going on because the spirit in us joined to God knows the good that it wants to do. But the flesh is always continually desiring to send us in a different direction. At the core of our being, something has to happen in order to make a right choice. And that's where the battle for our hearts is won or lost. You see, what happened was that in spite of the fact that God had taken and changed Saul, literally from the inside out, in spite of that, when God told Saul to go into battle, destroy the enemy, kill all of the animals, Saul chose to keep the best of the animals to be sacrificed on the altar for God. When Samuel found out, he said, "What are you doing? Why did you do that?" He said, "Well, quite clearly, look how good these animals are. I wanted to sacrifice them to God." And Samuel said, "You've disobeyed God. And as a result of that disobedience, you are going to lose the kingship that would otherwise have been on your family generation after generation after generation, all because you chose to disobey God." But here's what happened next. Then Samuel said that God was going to go seeking after a man with his own heart. Wow. So what we're seeing is that in order to make Saul king, God was willing to change this man, literally from the inside out. But when it came to the condition of his heart, God left that choice to Saul. Saul was the only one who could determine if his heart was for God. It's a huge lesson. It's an absolutely mammoth in size teaching for us from the Word of God, where He wants us to know that the condition of our heart is left up to us. He may change us in every other way. He may give us gifts in order for us to be able to fulfill the calling that is on our life. He may even change the attitudes of our minds so that we begin to forgive people because we've hurt them, and we decide that we need to be able to ask for forgiveness. He may even cause us to be the kind of people that choose to be servants first. But in spite of everything else that changes in our personality, at the very core of who we are as individuals, the one thing that God leaves up to us is the condition of our heart. Now, what does that mean? Our heart knows what is the good that we ought to be doing. Our heart knows that. And the condition of our heart will determine whether or not it influences our decisions at a soul level, so that the battle is won for the Lord. In other words, when we, by our heart condition, not only know what it's right to do, but inform our consciousness and our minds, and so that they are convinced to choose what it is right to do, and then follow through. Until that happens, we are subject to the sin nature, and we are subject to losing the battle. Now, what is the outcome, the picture that's being painted here? The battle is a daily battle. It's a fought on every front, on every day, in every relationship, with every choice. The issue for us is that when God reigns as king in our lives, it's our heart that becomes the chamber room for his glory. We're being asked to decide life or death in that room. Now, what has to happen is that we need to put our soul in such a position that it becomes subject to our spirit. The spirit must be given the right to reign, so that our soul becomes subject to the spirit's leading, not the other way around. In our lives, we have been so used to following the leading of our fleshly nature that we have not well enough understood what it feels like to follow our spirit's leading. And so what can happen is, because we are unfamiliar with what it is to follow the spirit, we follow our feelings, and the feelings are not of the spirit. The feelings are of the flesh. One of the things that we notice, even when Saul was told that the kingdom was going to be ripped from the hands of those who would come after, do you know what he said? Would it be all right, Samuel, to allow me to be honored before the elders of Israel first? He turned to his prideful nature, even knowing that God, because of his disobedience, was going to tear the kingdom out from under him. His first thought was for his own pride. He wanted to be honored before the elders of Israel. Flesh winning over the condition of his heart. Now, nobody ever said that this would be easy. You see, we have come to a place where we are used to following the leading of our sinful nature. We are used to following feelings. We are used to following emotions. We are used to feeling desires that come as a result of greed and pride and all of those things. We're used to feeling those things. We understand what it feels like. But very many of us don't know what it feels like to follow the leading of the Spirit. Can we say we know what it feels like to follow the leading of the Spirit? I think many of us, except by experience, might not easily be able to answer that question. And so what God has told us is that when he is looking to find those who are looking to become his servants, his heart is ranging all around the world, looking to strengthen those who are fully committed to him. Those are the ones that God is looking for. Saul was a king, but he was not fully committed to God. Saul's heart was divided. It's a battle that affects every single one of us. And it's a battle that we need to take note of so that we can recognize where the battle takes place and recognize that it's going to take a lot of training to learn how to follow the voice of the Spirit within us. It's a much quieter voice than the voice that rages within through emotion, through feelings, through senses, through touch. All of those things are so close to the surface. And it's the reason that our fleshliness is able to control. Those things are right close to the surface. But when it comes to the Spirit of God, so often it's just a little prick, just a quiet little voice. And God is asking us to make our mind, our will, and emotions subject to that still small voice. Oh my goodness. Except for the strength of God who is in us, none of us are up to winning this battle. Only the Spirit of God will equip us for this battle. But even more importantly, this is not a choice that God will make for us. This is a choice we have to make for ourselves. I want to close with the one statement that I made earlier that comes from the Passion Translation. It says this, I beg your pardon, comes from the writer of the Passion Translation. Doesn't actually come from the translation itself. He says this, when I reign as king of your life, your heart becomes the chamber room for my glory, and we are being asked to decide. So good being with you today.
Come, let us worship him, that we may seek him, that he may bless us. If we press